Excellent, thank you very much. Right, we probably expect a few more people, but we'll just see if people come in as we start. So I'll just start with a bit of kind of an introduction. Thank you very much for coming to this local plan update webinar. We're coming to the end of our series of webinars, actually. So if you've joined a few others, welcome back. But if this is your first one, you're very welcome, and we hope you find it really useful. This particular webinar is focused on the flood risk topic and is an opportunity for you to hear a short presentation and ask questions of the team. Before we begin the webinar properly, I'd like to outline the housekeeping arrangements for this session and to explain the format a little bit. So please note that this webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded publicly on YouTube for the benefit of others. And that's, as I'm sure you can appreciate, is just for those who weren't able to attend today. They'll still be able to see all the material that's presented and hear the answers to the questions that hopefully you'll be raising as part of the Q&A, which will follow. So all attendee microphones and videos have been turned off and they will remain off. To ask questions, please use the Q&A function within Zoom, which should be at the bottom of your screen. We'll attempt to answer the questions verbally, but if we run out of time, we'll try and make a record and email you a response. So we're probably going to have about a 15 to 20-minute presentation today, followed by a Q&A session with the panel. And the panel today, we've got Helen Miller, a Principal Planner for Policy and Plans. We've got Tom Beavis, the Principal Flood Risk Engineer. We've got myself, Adam Harvat, Group Manager for Policy and Plans, and Catherine Holloway, a Team Leader in the Policy and Plans team. We've also got Vash Bodiat, who's a Senior Planner in Policy and Plans, who's supporting the webinar as well. So what is this consultation about? Hopefully you'll have already grasped a lot of that, but I'll just repeat in case you haven't. So we're consulting on the local plan update, hopefully, as you know, and which will eventually contain a suite of new planning policies to help tackle the climate emergency. This is the earliest stage of consultation known as a scoping consultation. And this is about seeking agreement on what broad topics should be included in the plan. So we're consulting on ideas and options rather than specific or detailed policies at this stage. And broadly speaking, what we're looking for from this consultation is an understanding of whether people agree with this scope of policies or not, what their thoughts are on some of our ideas and options, and I guess most crucially, whether you feel that we've missed anything, whether you feel that we've perhaps not been ambitious enough, whether we've been too ambitious, how realistic are our proposals, and other aspects you think that we maybe need to think about that you don't feel that we've thought about maybe sufficiently so far. So all those kind of things to help us refine detailed policies, which will be the next stage of the plan. We've hosted a series of webinars covering the 5 different topic areas individually over the summer to help give you a chance to learn more about the topics and to ask any questions that you have. So today is flood risk. We held carbon reduction, placemaking, sustainable infrastructure and green infrastructure webinars over the last few weeks. But if you did miss any, don't worry, the recordings are all on YouTube. Also, finally, this is the first time that we've really held a series of webinars as part of a local plan consultation. So we'd really welcome any feedback you have in terms of how we can constructively improve it. We always want to make sure that we're being as good as we can. So anything we can do to improve things, please let us know using the email address lpu@leeds.gov.uk, which is on the bottom of the screen now. Right, so that's the end of the boring stuff. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Helen to begin the presentation on flood risk topic of the local plan update. So over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Adam. As part of our aspiration to make Leeds carbon neutral by 2030, we want to ensure that our communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change. Flood risk is one of the most direct impacts that Leeds faces. It's really important that we gather up-to-date evidence and plan for the best way to avoid, reduce and mitigate the risk. We're not starting from scratch because Leeds already has a good set of policies to help us manage flood risk. But given the climate change forecasts, we are looking at what else we can do within the remit of the planning system. This presentation explains some of the issues and challenges around managing flood risk and some of our suggestions about how we might shape new policy to help deal with these problems. I'm going to explain some of the difficulties we face around planning for new developments in areas with high flood risk, safeguarding land for flood storage, ensuring buildings are sufficiently resilient to flooding, encouraging more sustainable drainage systems, and also we'll take a look at using porous paving in front gardens to help manage flood risk. Next slide, please, Adam. Let's start by looking at some of the rainfall data from recent years. The Met Office statistics show that winters in the UK have got 12% wetter over the last 60 years. And they predict that rainfall is likely to rise by a further 20% by 2070, with an increase in rainfall intensity leading to 20% more flash flooding. This graph illustrates what's happened in Leeds in recent years, and the rainfall in 2015 was exceptionally high. Some areas of Leeds are prone to a high risk of river flooding, but there are also risks from flash flooding and surface water runoff. Next slide, please. The Boxing Day floods of 2015 resulted in the highest river levels ever recorded on both the River Wharfe and the Aire, notably more than a metre higher than the Great Flood of Leeds 1866. This is an image of Kirkstall during the Boxing Day floods 2015. The railway line is underwater and Morrison's and the Kirkstall Retail Park are flooded. They recovered surprisingly quickly, which would not have been possible if homes had been built there instead of retail. But the predicted increases in rainfall could create problems for Leeds and potentially could lead to more people suffering the devastating impacts of flooding. So it's really important that we build the right development in the right place. Next slide, please. Flood risk in the UK is divided into different zones according to the probability of flooding. These flood zones are set by the Environment Agency and don't take account of any defences, and they don't include the possible impacts of climate change. Flood Zone 1 has the lowest probability of flood risk, and Flood Zone 3 has the highest. Flood Zone 3B is what is known as functional floodplain, where water has to flow or be stored in times of flood. The probability of flooding in these areas is a 1 in 20 year risk or 5% probability. Next slide, please. There are probabilities for both river and surface water flooding. This is a map of the river flood risk zones in Leeds. The red and blue areas have a 1 in 20 year flood risk probability, or 5%. This map is out of date now, and we're updating it in the Strategic Flood Risk Assessment, or SFRA, to reflect the benefits of the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme and the latest data from the Environment Agency. The SFRA will also map the extent of the increase in flood risk due to climate change, known as the Climate Change Allowance. Next slide, please. The Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme, or FAS as it's known, and other schemes, will provide some protection for areas in and around Leeds. The Leeds FAS is a scheme for the River Aire from Woodlesford up to Newlay Bridge. The first section is already constructed and operational, known as FAS 1. This section from the railway station to the Nostrup Weirs has a standard of protection of 1 in 100 annual probability of river flooding, including a climate change allowance to 2039, whilst the section at Woodlesford has a 1 in 200 level of protection. The second section, FAS 2, includes measures that will have the effect of upgrading the FAS 1 to a 1 in 200 standard of protection, and includes a climate change allowance up to 2039, and is looking to identify sacrificial land that is designed to flood, which will further help us to make space for floodwater. The Council are also implementing flood alleviation schemes on the River Wharfe at Otley and on the Whitebeck and Wortley Beck. But neither national nor local funding exists to provide defences for all the urban areas at risk across the district. Next slide, please. In Leeds, significant parts of the urban area include land in flood zones 2 and 3. So it's inevitable that some development takes place in those areas. We use the government's sequential and exception tests to avoid locating inappropriate development in those areas. For example, homes are classed as more vulnerable to flood risk, so they are not appropriate in high flood risk areas. The sequential test is used to try to avoid locating the more vulnerable developments in the flood risk areas. So we can only locate homes there when there are no other reasonable alternative sites in a lower risk flood zone. After passing the sequential test, some applications must also pass the exception test. This means that they have to demonstrate wider sustainability benefits for the community that outweigh the risk. For example, to ensure that town centres remain viable. And adequate mitigation must be in place for the lifetime of the development and without making flood risk worse elsewhere. Developers are also encouraged to lay out development so that the open uses are located in the most risky parts of the site and the built development avoids those areas. We want to locate homes close to the services and facilities that people need, whilst avoiding developments in high flood risk areas. There is an important balance to be struck between flood risk and other sustainability benefits, such as the need for regeneration, the efficient use of brownfield land, and access to services. If policy tests are made tighter to further reduce the number of permissions for more vulnerable developments in flood risk areas, this could result in people living further away from the services and facilities they need. This would then result in longer journeys and add to the emission of greenhouse gases and other pollutant gases. As an example, Kirkstall meets a lot of the aspects of what is known as a 20-minute neighbourhood, which you may have heard us discussing in the placemaking webinar. The shops and services that people need are generally within a 20-minute walk from where they live, but it also has problems with flood risk. There are lots of other areas in Leeds that are similar, such as in Wetherby and Utley. We would like to hear your views on how we can get the balance right between locating homes close to the services and facilities that people need, whilst avoiding the high flood risk areas. Next slide, please. Areas of functional floodplain with a 1 in 20 flood probability are used for flood storage, and we safeguard those areas so that only water-compatible uses and essential infrastructure are permitted. Leeds is fortunate that much of the River Aire, as it flows through the urban area, will have the benefit of the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme, and therefore significant parts of the urban area that would have otherwise flooded with a 1 in 20 year probability will be protected. The SFRA will look at reclassifying those areas so they are not defined as having a flood storage function. For those areas that have a 1 in 20 probability of flood risk, but don't have the benefit of a flood alleviation scheme, the redevelopment potential will continue to be limited due to the high flood risk probability. The SFRA will map the extent of these areas and the impact of climate change. The local plan update may consider the policy options for limiting developments in those locations. This is only likely to affect those areas that have a very high level of flood risk and are not protected by a flood alleviation scheme. We would like your views on whether the local plan update should consider limitations on urban expansion in unprotected areas with a very high probability of flooding. Next slide, please. When development can't be avoided in flood risk areas, we want to ensure it is constructed to be resilient and doesn't make flood risk worse elsewhere. We ask for details of flood mitigation measures in a flood risk assessment. We are looking at whether the local plan update should set new standards for flood resilient development, including things like how to provide safe access and egress, and whether there should be any limitations on accommodation for more vulnerable groups, such as older people in high flood risk areas. And we would really like to hear your views on this. Next slide, please. We want to reduce the speed of surface water runoff through the use of sustainable drainage systems. That's the kind of flood risk sometimes known as flash flooding. SUDs manage surface water close to where it falls and mimic natural drainage compared to the conventional practice of draining water runoff through a pipe into a sewer. Practical examples include soakaways, which drain water through permeable surfaces into the ground, and ponds which drain water into a surface water body. This water network is sometimes referred to as blue infrastructure. SUDs have lots of benefits, and I've listed a few of them here. They improve water quality by reducing pollutants such as metals and hydrocarbons from roads and car parks, so water entering a local watercourse is cleaner and does not harm wildlife habitats. They can provide a valuable amenity asset for local residents and create new habitats for wildlife. Any problems with the system are quicker and easier to identify than with a conventional underground pipe system and are generally more straightforward to rectify. SUDs can also provide passive cooling, which helps to mitigate the effect of temperature rise due to climate change. National policy means that at present, we can't insist on sustainable drainage if the developer can show that a traditional system will be cheaper. We would like your views on how we can make SUDs a firmer requirement for development. Next slide, please. Paving over front gardens can increase flood risk when rainwater can't drain naturally because impermeable materials have been used. Also, the loss of vegetation can increase air pollution in urban areas and affect the character and appearance of traditional streetscapes. The intensification of built development through the use of permitted development rights, for example, to build extensions and garages, and the impact of climate change can make it worse. We're keen to explore what approaches we could take to ensure that where landscaping and gardens provide a valuable function in helping manage flood risk, they are not lost through permitted development rights that allow the householder to build extensions, garages or other structures that reduce the extent of the area available for absorption. One of the options may be to provide further guidance to householders on using porous materials when they are planning to convert front gardens to parking space. We would like to hear your views on this and whether you think the local plan update should consider what approaches could be taken to limit permitted development rights for new developments to ensure open areas that are needed for flood risk management are retained. Next slide, please. We're hoping that you're inspired by this webinar to go into the local plan scoping consultation and complete the questionnaire. You can answer the questions on flood risk, or you can also complete the questions for the other topic areas too. You can find the questionnaires and more information about this on the Leeds Local Plan Scoping Consultation at www.leeds.gov.uk/LPU, or you can email us with your comments at lpu@leeds.gov.uk. Thank you for listening, and I'll now hand over to Adam to take us through the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was, fantastic walk through, I think, some of the really important issues and aspects that we're trying to consider as part of the flood risk topic paper. We haven't got any questions so far, but I'll just pause, I think, to allow a bit of time for people to ask those questions. I guess just to reiterate as well, as Helen said, if people don't feel they're able to ask any questions right now, but then come back to it later, please feel free to use that email address and we can answer any questions. But this is obviously a good opportunity for you to put any questions here when you've got people like Helen and Tom and Kat here to answer any questions that you may have. And you may have particular thoughts, I suppose, on Helen touched on issues like Kirkstall and the 20-minute neighbourhoods, excuse me, concept, and how we better move forward with those kind of concepts when we know that some of those areas are vulnerable to flooding. And you may have questions surrounding that, or may have comments about that, and that'd be really useful to pick up on. So I'll pause for a minute and see if any more questions come through. Okay. Okay, we've got a couple of comments there. Thanking for the presentation, which you're very, very welcome. So thank you for attending. And yeah, it would be really useful. I mean, the point that's made by the comment that they'll respond through the website. And yeah, we'd encourage everybody, whether who's on this webinar live now or watching this as a recording. The deadline for comments is the 13th of September. So you've still got about 3 weeks to go through, and you can save your comments as you're going through, so you don't need to worry about completing your whole series of questions. And it's framed in 2 different ways. So we've got short summary kind of questionnaires if you know you've only got probably 5 minutes, but if you know you've got longer and you'd like to give fuller answers to a bit more detailed questions of the kind that Helen's already taken us through today, then there's the full consultation questions as well. But you're very welcome for the presentation, and we look forward to receiving your comments. So I'll just pause for another minute to see if anyone has any further comments. But otherwise, obviously, as I said, feel free to send us any questions that you may have via our email address, which we'll be happy to pick up any questions that you might have. Okay, well, no problem. If people didn't want to ask any questions, that's absolutely fine. Just all that remains really, we can close the webinar early, and we'll reconvene. We're going to have another webinar at 7 o'clock this evening. And all that really remains, I guess, is for me to thank Helen for a fantastic presentation. Clearly answered every question that could possibly have ever arisen. And so no need for questions. So thank you for that, Helen. Very much appreciated. Thank you for Tom, Catherine, and Vash for attending as well, being on hand. Very much appreciated. And thank you particularly for the attendees who've turned up, for giving your valuable time. It's very much appreciated. And for those watching this on record, thank you very much for watching. So enjoy the rest of your mornings, and we'll see you all later. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.